Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. Recorded Future. They help security teams make more confident decisions faster. Recorded Future's technology automates broad collection and analysis of cyber threat data and delivers the rich external context you need to understand alerts and emerging threats. With real-time threat intelligence from Recorded Future, security teams respond to threats 63% faster and find undetected threats 10 times quicker. To get started, go to recordedfuture.com/securityweekly and sign up for the Recorded Future Cyber Data. Every day, you'll receive an email with the top results for trending technical indicators, cyber news, exploited vulnerabilities, suspicious IP addresses, and more. Subscribe today and stay ahead of cyber attacks. Endgame's converged endpoint security platform is transforming security programs, their people, processes, and technology with the most powerful endpoint protection and simplest user experience, ensuring analysts of any skill level can stop targeted attacks before information theft. Endgame unifies prevention, detection, and threat hunting to stop known and unknown attacker behaviors at scale with a single agent. For more information, visit endgame.com. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly, where we're burning cigars pretty slow, drinking wine a little faster than we're smoking the cigars. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. The Layer 8 conference has 2 tracks of talks on social engineering and open source intelligence gathering. The conference is the only one of its kind. It will be held on Saturday, June 8th in Providence, Rhode Island, right here in our home state. Check out the Mental Health Hackers Village, the tool Lockpick Village, and a CTF hosted by Trace Labs. All that and more at layer8conference.com. We hope to see you there. We'll be there all day recording shows, and many of us will be giving talks. So Patrick Laverty is someone who I've worked with for a really long time. We worked together at the university and have done a lot of different things in the security community together. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Our guest request form, that's right. If you watch or listen to the show and you're like, I really wish the Security Weekly folks would interview this person, we hear you. You can go to securityweekly.com/guests. You can enter your suggestions, and we've already received a lot of suggestions and have converted those into interviews on the show already. So keep it coming. I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Agreed.
And I just want to thank those people who've been writing in and saying you want to interview me. Love you.
Yeah. We'll do that. We will do that at some point, Joff.
Wait, people have been writing in and asking for that?
It's Joff with his scripts.
Joff is just going to he's hacked the guest request form.
Python
he's just got his Python shell script just running constantly.
Man, I got some artificial intelligence on that.
That's right.
You'll note that I didn't do it this time.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say this time. Normally, that's your gig, Larry.
Yeah,
right?
No, only John Strand versus John Strand.
That's it. Our interview is not Joff. It's actually Guru. He's the founder and CEO of Cloudneeti, a software as a service company focused on continuous cloud security, data privacy, and compliance assurance. You can find out more at cloudneeti.com/securityweekly. That's cloudneeti.com. Guru, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, good afternoon, good evening.
Yes, nice to have you.
Cigar smoking folks, happy to be here.
Yes, it's that relaxed environment that we like to bring people into and talk about technology. And I'm excited to talk about the technology that you've built. So, Guru, I guess start by telling the story of why you founded the company, how you founded the company to solve this problem that we have with cloud and cloud applications.
Oh, absolutely. So in about 2016 or so, we were working with a couple of enterprises in a consulting space, trying to help them have secure architectures, migrate their data centers over to the public cloud, but more focused on getting their architectures, their deployment working on Azure and AWS. And about 3 or 4 enterprises approached us, almost in a span of about 4 to 5 months time, asking us on how do we get visibility kind of a centralized dashboard for their security posture. And then one of the auditors came in and said, hey, we are actually working with these enterprises. Can you also overlay a compliance overview on top of it? So one thing led to the other. Some of these projects started getting converted into some quick starts, and over a period of time, we built a product around it.
And Guru, what I love about that story is that you really started with people coming to you with a problem. And like, there is no better situation to start a company.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's realizing that there's people out there with this problem and you could build a solution is just a beautiful beginning to a company.
Well, you might actually say that, but that we saw it much differently. They came to us saying, not so much from a product standpoint, that they knew that we've been doing such work in the space. Microsoft and AWS connected us to these customers, and the request did not come in as, hey, can you go build something? It came in very, very weird. So, hey, we already have Azure deployment and AWS deployment. We have no idea whether we should go to production with it. The CISOs came in and they say that they will not sign off, on something that they have no idea about. And it was a very unique situation where the CISOs actually blocked, production, releases, and that's where we were called in. More of an emergency fix on how would the enterprises actually find the visibility of their security posture. So it came in as a very weird way,
right?
But it came in over and over, and we realized that it's a massive problem.
Yeah. No, you had great vision to see that there was a product there. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So tell our audience a little bit about the solution and the problem that it solves for your customers today, and how it does that.
Yeah, so I think that's a good segue. Well, kind of let me introduce on what specifically that we are trying to solve. In most of these enterprise conversations, we realize there are three large problems. The first problem is that customers are looking for, they have multi-cloud deployments. Either they are migrating to the public cloud, they might have some on-prem data centers, or they are in hosted data centers, if you will, but now they are wholeheartedly adopting Azure and AWS, right? In such a scenario, the biggest security risk that they see is they have no visibility, around their security posture. They cannot enforce any kind of organizational standards, be it an internal standard, be it, let's say, a NIST or a PCI DSS standard. They really can't enforce it. And the third, and a bigger problem that they started seeing is how do they govern their cloud adoption? So Cloudneeti, came into being primarily to solve the misconfiguration issues, and the way that we dealt with it was to really, provide these three aspects: visibility, compliance reporting, and managing or governing the public cloud adoption. In this particular way, we are primarily looking at identifying and eliminating cloud risks. That's how the product came into being.
It's funny, Guru, and I've summarized that on a show, probably while drinking, where I said misconfiguration leads to compromise, and that phrase just kind of stuck around for a while. But I mean, that's really the heart and soul of the problem that you're addressing.
Enterprises had a way to do this on their end devices when those devices were in the data center.
Yeah.
Right? They would have a configuration management solution. They would go out and validate against CIS or a STIG or something like that.
Because it was an operating system and some applications, and we worked at Tenable, right, where we did a lot of that.
Had tools. I built the one at Qualys, policy compliance.
Yeah.
And so there was a known way to look at the configuration, compare it to known benchmarks or baselines. But as soon as you moved to the cloud and you didn't control that environment much anymore, it created this gap of, well, how do I now do configuration management, not only of the infrastructure in the cloud, but the cloud account itself, which was a big gap in the market, which is obviously what your customers, Guru, were struggling with, and it needed a new solution, because the old solutions that were very endpoint focused weren't going to necessarily deal with the configuration of the cloud account itself and how it was configured, let alone necessarily some aspects of the infrastructure. Now,
Guru, borrowing on some what Haroon said, and I think it's really insightful of Haroon to say, a lot of security practitioners will say, well, if I've got an AWS instance and I'm deploying infrastructure or applications to it, I'm an expert. I've been around. I can learn this stuff, and I can control my own configuration. right? But I think that quickly falls down into needing some tools to help you do that, right?
Oh yeah. So I think what Matt was also kind of mentioning that the real origins of these kind of a product line, if you will, and Gartner started calling it as Cloud Security Posture Assessment or CSPM in general, posture management. It starts off with customers have no idea on how to configure their cloud accounts, and traditional tools. As I think Matt and Paul, you are very aware of it, that all of them are endpoint or virtual machine or host based or sometimes even network based, right? Most of these security auditing tools, compliance tools, or be for that matter, even perimeter management tools, came into being primarily on network and host. But cloud, created, a mass of, differentiated workloads, if you will, which are more cloud native. How would you put an agent on top of a PaaS service? Let's say you have an Azure or an AWS PaaS service, just a website or an API, services, if you will. There is no virtual machine. You can't deploy your agents there. How to manage serverless containers? Serverless, it could be Azure functions or AWS Lambda or Google functions. Most of the time, the deployments are open to the internet, right? There is no network boundary at all. So you can't control through perimeter or network. You can't control through agent-based or host-based. So there's no agents, there's no virtual network. The only available controls now would be, more app security, more identity-based security, and, kind of TLS and SSL, and even the token-based security.
Also, in that serverless environment, there's really no file for me to audit, right? Like when we were doing configuration auditing on at Tenable, if there was an application, we weren't so much tied to that application, but that application had some kind of configuration file, and I could go audit that configuration file. In serverless, like there's no real files anymore, right?
Well, serverless has still an endpoint, right? You still call an endpoint, and it will still have data in transit kind of encryption. You still have enablement of maybe SSL, TLS, custom domains. It will still have CORS, kind of the application level cross origin aspects. It will have aspects around whether your specific entry points are SQL injection protected. Are they so there are various configurations in the public cloud that are auto-enabled for you, meaning they allow it for you, but you have to still configure it.
I got you.
These serverless functions, if you will, also contain some frameworks. You could have a .NET or a Java or a Python framework, and many times these are let's say you would take in a Python 3.6 kind of a framework that you attach to your AWS Lambda or an Azure function. Over a period of time, it will have vulnerabilities, right? So you will have to go and test against these vulnerabilities. So there are a whole slew of things that you can even do on top of serverless. And thankfully, the cloud providers like Azure, AWS, and Google, they will provide these set of best practices. But it is extremely difficult for you to kind of look into a large checklist and see. In fact, AWS has published somewhere closer to 40 plus best practices for AWS Lambda, right? Azure has published closer to 67 best practices. Google has recently published about 30 plus, serverless best practices, and they're continually adding. How would you kind of manage all of these checklists and make sure that these are protected and these configurations are managed? And that's the problem that we are trying to solve. And you add on top of it, you have virtual machines, you have containers, you have SaaS apps, like you have Office 365, Dropbox, various maybe CASB kind of products, but getting tied into the newer space. You have newer workloads like machine learning. You would have, a database as a service, which has various open endpoints. So now the problem gets bigger and bigger because the workloads are very, very diverse. I think that's the root.
You're scaring me, Guru, because I have some of those things that I'm like, I'm not really auditing them today.
Right, like our RDS database and all the AWS account configuration.
EC2. I know what you're doing tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, Paul, you can run our product, on your installation, and you'll seriously notice that there are so many RDS configurations on AWS, so many storage accounts.
And so I want to tell a quick story about how that happened. So we were moving infrastructure into the cloud, like you described so many organizations doing, right? And I think this happens fairly often, where like I come into work, I'm founder of the company and doing the architecture design for it, and I come to work one day and I'm like, where's the database container? And the developers are like, oh, we're just using RDS now and it's all working. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool, I think, right? But that's how it happens, right?
Yeah.
And the other, kind of a dovetail of that was, I was telling a story earlier, I was reading some documentation about how to deploy Python apps and using your example guru. And I'm like, oh, it's like a whole tutorial on how to push them up into Google Cloud. I'm like, that's really cool. And it looks really easy.
And that's how you get ants.
And that's how you get ants. Yes, that is exactly how you get ants.
Google App Engine, same sort of thing. When Ben Jackson and I were doing the whole stuff with the metadata stuff, the website that does all the back-end data analysis that was doing all of the analysis of all the images on Twitter got pushed to Google App Engine. It's still there, and I have no idea how it works. Oh, well.
Yeah. Well, I think, and not to scare you guys, but in general, I think this is a kind of a real experience that we had with two enterprises, although they might not publicly, go live with something like this, right? So these enterprises, they bought AWS accounts and Azure subscriptions, right? From a dev standpoint, they had nothing deployed on it, no virtual machines, no workloads of any kind, right? But they were still active, and they had a budget, an unlimited budget on these, and we were in the process of starting to use them to start building them, and it so happened that they were their identity and access management systems were hijacked. They were their accounts or credentials were pawned. And when we started actually using it, we found that there are a couple of virtual machines, really big virtual machines, about 128 CPUs, massive massive storages, really large compute clusters. And then we inquired, like, who's really running it? Actually, nobody was, within the enterprise, had ownership of it, which essentially meant that they were cryptojacked. Right. Their accounts were hijacked, and and nobody knew about it.
And they were running Bitcoin harvesting.
Yeah, and you don't realize
out of your environment to
get a $100,000 bill for your compute for the month.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Nice.
So, and I think that's the first time we saw that that traditional tools would not work. Traditional tools will only look at network and host. This is a new game, right? Where account hijacking becomes the first ball that the hijackers can roll in and see whether it operates. If it operates, they don't care about your workloads. They can stand up something new and try something like Bitcoin harvesting, and we've experienced it ourselves. Some of our enterprise customers experience it ourselves. This is crazy.
Didn't we have that issue?
Well, we did. Yeah, someone deployed a new container because we left an API open. Thankfully, it was a denial of service attack, and we got traffic. We had configured some monitoring around the compute side, so billing we would get notifications, and bandwidth we would get notifications, so we were notified that happened, right? But before there was all these cloud services, if an attacker got into your system and was using the compute, it really wasn't a big deal. Like, yeah, if they stole some data, that might be a big deal. But if they were just using it for compute, it was like, I'm not getting a $100,000 bill. Like, I go back to the story where at the university we had this big supercomputer, right? And someone broke in and was using the compute cycles on it, and no one really noticed until the attacker started applying patches so that other attackers wouldn't get in. And then they were like, wait, why are all these patches being applied? But I mean, they cleaned it up.
Why is this shit not broken anymore?
Yeah, exactly. Right? And they cleaned it up and kicked the attackers out, and it's not a big deal, except now in the cloud you get a big bill.
You're gonna get a bill for not only the compute, but the big ones, the bandwidth. That's the one that's gonna nail you too.
Yeah, the bandwidth, the compute.
I've got another scenario I'm trying to get my head around.
Huge databases. We've seen some really crazy things as well.
Go ahead, Lee.
So one of the scenarios we've been talking about is beyond, we talk about protecting it at rest in the cloud and en route to the cloud. is they're talking about protecting data while being processed, and
Mm-hmm.
who on the cloud service can scrape data out of memory. And
Mhm.
that's been really perplexing. And I'm wondering, have you run into that use case yet?
So I think probably Matt, keeps talking about host or app and user, kind of these three tiers, if you will. And we have seen that in transit or in memory, really being attacked at the app level, right, or within app. And I think tools like Qualys is trying to go look at that, but we have seen that in the pure cloud world, Azure and AWS, they are investing very heavily into in-app protection, app whitelisting, kind of scenarios. So the risks, are getting reduced, but unfortunately, these are not enabled by default, and that's again a configuration that the customers will have to deploy. But we've seen threats being coming out from Azure and AWS. You have, you call in a guard duty, you call in, Azure Security Center API, and you will find a thread that something was run, a specific server, had a specific, app or a process for whom the memory boundaries were violated, and nobody can tell why they were violated, right? And then you start digging into it, and you'll see that hey, there's a small pattern that's coming in. Some process somewhere, had a remote access available, and that comes in only once in like X number of days, and tries, kind of a recon mission to go find out what's vulnerable and attempts to do that, and then it goes silent. So it is a trend that is happening.
Because I run into some conversations, and the quick answer seems to be, well, if you're worried about it being accessed, just encrypt it all en route to and from the cloud so that you're not putting unencrypted data in the cloud. But that makes it kind of hard to process on the remote end.
Yeah, it's across the board, right? On the a lot of new SaaS apps that enterprises are consuming, right? They are delivered over the browser, and the browsers, right, sometimes don't have CORS enabled, a CORS enabled, right? Or for that matter, their JavaScript tooling itself, can be hacked. Sometimes man in the middle. I think the previous gentleman before this call talking about honeypots. So some of these things are getting more and more, if you will, visible, because of the SaaS delivery models, because of even the SaaS or the ISVs who are building these things. They don't go through their own penetration testing, but enterprises will now consume them because these are small microservices. They won't think they might be vulnerable. A simple example being, we were using SendGrid, we were using Twilio. These are SaaS-enabled services that developers will think that, hey, I want to send a pager, I want to send a notification, let me go use that. And unfortunately, these are not always enabled through SSL, right? Sometimes even TLS 1.0 or older versions of SSL are being, deployed for that. So which means that man-in-the-middle attacks, pretty much are certain. You can put a network monitor, within the enterprise, and being able to kind of sniff out, look at some of these SSLs, and being able to go against it. So yes, these are a lot of these SaaS apps, coming into the enterprises being deployed, and that makes it, very difficult to manage that as well. I hope I didn't stray much beyond your question there.
No, you did great. It's not trivial.
Guru, I wanted to go back to, even in smaller organizations, let alone large enterprises, you have people deploying new technology, and you may not know about it. Does Cloudneeti help with that, or do you have to do a discovery process and then apply compliance so that they are deploying that securely?
So we have three use cases that, or rather three kind of buyer personas that come and knock on our doors. The first one is someone who's migrating to the public cloud for the first time, right? And they were referred to us either through the cloud provider like Azure or AWS, right? Or some of our partners, some of the managed services partners would bring us to the table. And we find them that, they would not understand cloud security best practices at all, right? So some of these things we have to go and educate them that cloud is different, just like we are talking about it now. We have to go sit down with them. Most times they would have either infrastructure engineers, someone who has a background around networking or app developers, right? They won't have, especially small ISVs or mid-size or SMB kind of companies, they won't have an InfoSec team or a GRC team. They would bring us in for educational purposes, and they will use our product, to do a quick assessment of where they stand. Because our product is agentless, deployed as a SaaS service, right? The onboarding time it takes is about less than 5 to 10 minutes for them to, bring in their AWS, Office 365, or Azure subscriptions to the table. They would be able to go quickly assess where they stand.
And so, so in that case, right, I mean, you would have certain kind of benchmarks to evaluate against those
Correct.
different cloud accounts and
Correct.
be able to come back and analyze, okay, this is best practice for O365 or for your Azure configuration. Give them a quick checklist to say, okay, here's where you have gaps in your configurations. These are things you might want to look at and turn on or reconfigure to enforce a better compliance posture.
You mean it would have told me, hey, dummy, don't leave your Docker API open to the internet?
Would it have done that, Guru,
Yeah,
for him?
Yeah. So trust me, I think what Paul mentioned, that happens all the time. Docker API has been exposed to the internet all the time. We have Kubernetes clusters that are open to the internet, all the time, right? We would have virtual machines with RDP access enabled all the time, right? There's nobody who will go ahead and put, a JIT or just-in-time access at all. We would have storage accounts, be it S3 buckets or Azure storage accounts open to the internet all the time, right? So these are things
I
that
only feel a little better, Guru.
He only made one of those mistakes,
One,
not all
just
of those.
one. And we fixed
It
it
only
fast.
takes one, though.
Except
only
for I
t-
don't think you've checked your RDS configuration to make sure it's not open to the internet.
No, I have not.
Guess what he's doing tomorrow,
Yep.
ladies and gentlemen.
Tonight when I get home.
Yeah. But to tie into what Matt was mentioning, right? So these customers will ask us, hey, we either want to be secure. So some of these customers start off with a security angle that, hey, I want to make sure that I am following all the CIS best practices, or in general all the security best practices, across the board, right? Regardless of which benchmark I choose. So in that case, we provide them with a cloud security best practices policy package, which tells them, within about 10 minutes or so, that your X percentage or your so many policies that are, that you fail or pass, right? The second set of customers that will ask us is, I want to go ahead and achieve, let's say, PCI DSS compliance or HIPAA compliance or NIST or FFIEC compliance. So we support about 11 plus compliance frameworks. So they would start tinkering around, they would have usually about 10 to 20 odd, cloud subscriptions. Could be a combination of Azure, AWS, and M365 or Office 365. And they want to get an aggregated view that, hey, I want to be sure that once I get in front of the auditor, I'm able to go produce the evidence to them. So they would start almost 3 to 6 months earlier and start working with us on continuous compliance. So the first day they will say that, hey, I am about X percentage compliance, and they would, they would work with us on what are the top things that I should go solve so that I reduce the risk, initially from a security standpoint, and over a period of time, I get better and better from a compliance standpoint. So that's the second kind of customer that comes and works with us, and we are releasing a risk posture very soon to them, trying to tell them that these are the things that you should do within the first 15 days or 30 days time frame. At least close off all of your, internet-enabled or internet-facing services. These are the things that you should do. So we'll kind of give them a quick wins checklist and then follow up with a 60-day or a 90-day kind of a guidance. But that's the second kind of customer. The third kind of customer that we kind of get is usually the GRC or the risk auditors. And it's very funny that you'd think that the risk auditors or compliance auditors will understand how to audit. Most of the times they're really good at people, processes, trainings, whether your endpoint devices are good or not, but they are completely, I would say even illiterate, if you will, if you want to go till that state about cloud security and cloud compliance. So they would use our product, to even understand how to look at compliance. We have some PCI DSS QSAs who are, auditing, as third party to their customers. they would deploy our product, get the audit reports, and then work with the customer on advising on various risks. That's the third kind of customers that we find who use our product from an auditing standpoint.
Yeah, I think the point there is that the IT auditors know the traditional IT audit skills, which is network, endpoint, etc., but may not have had to deal with auditing in the cloud. And what do they really need to look for there to perform an audit to verify a level of compliance in this new world?
Exactly, yeah. I think, I got distracted. Paul was handing out the wine bottle, and I was just about to go and grab it.
You have to make a visit here to the studio.
I know.
Guru.
I can't get this to you fast enough. You're in Seattle, baby, so...
Yeah, sorry, I missed a train of thought there. But yeah, the internal auditors, also don't sometimes understand, how to audit workloads which are not network or host-based. So we have one of the ISVs who's purely serverless, right? Including the front end is serverless. They have nothing deployed, from a host standpoint or even a networking standpoint, right? They only have like AWS Lambda functions and an RDS, an RDS database, behind the scenes. But even that they are converting into a consumption plan, right? AWS has announced a few of them. Even that's becoming serverless. So that makes the internal auditor very queasy about how do I audit something that it doesn't understand.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
I want to go to the pen testers in the room and those in the audience. I'd like to hear from you as well. We've talked about basically cloud security for the majority of this segment. Is that coming up on your radar? Is that in scope? Are you making it in scope? Are you finding vulnerabilities in cloud architecture, or is it still really like kind of going back to Haroon's example of finding some AWS keys and getting access to the infrastructure? Guru also gave an example of that as well. How is this included in scope on your pen test, and if so, in what capacity?
Well, I can weigh in really quick.
Go ahead, John.
Paul. I would say yes, but what I'm typically seeing is cloud deployed web applications becoming in scope quite frequently, and also the other example that you just put out there, and that is in the context of some pen test, be it an internal, external, maybe even web app, or some sort of source code review, you find a token disclosure in there that you then leverage to gain much wider access to data that you probably shouldn't have access to, right? So I think a little bit of both. We are seeing some cloud architecture, security review kind of work come around as well here and there.
Joff, so are you seeing some of these open accounts, like open database access, open Docker API? Are you guys actually testing for some of those open to the public capabilities that should be closed down? Do you see those in your pen test? I'm just curious how much of that you actually see.
Well, that's hard to comment on because I haven't been as involved with those tests as some of the other folks in the company lately. I've been more focused on internal network pen tests and some malware development work. So I can't give you a recent example there, but I'm going to guess yes. Maybe Larry has some input on that.
I'm Joff. I'm unfortunately about the same sort of stance as you are.
You guys have a different focus,
different focus. I'd like to say, I think we probably have, based on some of the, the rumblings that I hear about. Oh my God, I can't believe they did that going on.
Yeah, I will tell you that I have encountered on a number of tests in the past situations where somebody left, a source repository sitting on a production server somewhere that I discovered, managed to pilfer storage tokens from it, managed to write, Python scripts using the Boto library to actually, access storage and investigate that and use it to my advantage. So these kinds of things definitely are happening. I think it's a problem from the perspective of, I think, kind of exec level. people, and it may not just be at exec level, so don't take me wrong, execs out there, but I think people do have the impression somewhere along the line that once I go cloud, maybe my security problems are over. And I think that's an impression that we need to talk about a little bit more, because that's certainly not the case. We all know that. We need to communicate that message that your security problems and responsibilities don't get checked at the door once you sign up to a cloud provider.
Yeah, I mean, this is the old adage when you outsourced, right? You could outsource the risk or outsource the function, but you couldn't outsource the risk. Same kind of exists, I think, in the cloud environment. You might be outsourcing your infrastructure to the cloud, but the configuration of that account is still your responsibility as an organization. Yes, the cloud providers have added additional security features, but they may not be turned on by default. And how do you know that those configurations are correct, such that you can configure the environment correctly, secure it a little more, and then leverage some of those tools to help add additional layers of protection from your cloud provider? But again, you've got to know that they're enabled or not.
Yeah, Guru, one of the reoccurring themes that I keep hearing and seeing in the news is abuse of the authentication and authorization piece. And I think this kind of is a parallel to when I read about DNS hijacking. I'm like, oh, it's some super cool like network attack and they're hijacking the DNS. And then I read the article. I'm like, oh, like they password sprayed to get into whoever was hosting, the registrar, and they just changed their DNS servers. I feel like a lot of the same things are happening in cloud environments, that the like most basic level is to protect your cloud assets. You got to have proper authentication and authorization and some processes and technology around notifying you if that happens, for example. Are there a lot of cloud configuration type audits that can help organizations improve their authentication schemes?
Maybe at slightly at a broader level, right? So there are 4 or 5 different kinds of issues that even for like a pen tester and auditor need to be educated about. The first one is in the cloud world, identity and access is becoming one of the primary perimeter, if you will, right? The primary protection layer, if you will, and understanding AWS IAM and Azure Active Directory based IAM, it's very, very different than understanding your on-prem Active Directory, right? So
I would argue, Guru, it's hard right now to figure out how that stuff works, let alone how to secure it. I mean, having written some scripts this week that interface with various APIs, just figuring out how you're supposed to authenticate to make it work is a challenge today.
It is a challenge. Authentication is a challenge. Granting role-based access, permissions, which is kind of dual layer, right? So one for your DevOps teams, right, who has access to your operational data, and other from an app standpoint to your users, right? Most of the times, your focus is around, external, authorizations, or even for that matter, app-based, or role-based security. But most of the attacks that happen on your infrastructure happen to be more from the DevOps, or the controls there are not met, the RBACs are not met. That's one thing that needs to be protected. The second, and we have seen this like almost in closer to 15 odd customers just in the last 3 months, right? That nobody knows how to monitor, right? Even if there is a preventative control, right? You might be able to audit those preventative controls once in a quarter or so. There's no detection controls. There's no monitoring controls, right? That hey, someone accessed my RDP, my virtual machine. Someone made a request to, let's say, the Docker API, or someone made a request to my to my virtual machines, my containers, my SaaS services, PaaS services, and so on and so forth.
And that's a great point. Like, how do I know that someone is abusing some kind of OAuth token that's stepping outside? Like, I know my application does a very specific thing and uses OAuth to authenticate. It's pretty easy, if you have the monitoring capabilities, to know that something else like stepped outside the bounds of what normally happens. Monitoring that is really hard.
And AWS and Azure particularly, and very recently Google announced various set of monitoring associated to pretty much all of their services. Unfortunately, none of these are enabled by default. Right? and every single service, and AWS has about 160 plus services. Azure has about 150 plus services. For each one of them, there is a slight variation on how do you enable monitoring, right? Some you enable monitoring by going, attaching that to your storage accounts. Some you enable it through CloudTrail. Some you enable it by going directly to your local SIM, and Azure has their own SIM now, which is called Azure Sentinel. Some will go and put that into a log analytics or some kind of storage bucket, if you will. So each of these services are to be configured differently, and customers really need to understand how to enable them by default, right? That's the second boundary, if you will, on from a detection standpoint, whether whether somebody has accessed it and can you actually monitor it. Most times what we have seen is enterprises will say, hey, I have Splunk, right? I don't need to think about it, but they don't configure all of the data coming in from all of these services that they have on Azure and AWS connected to Splunk, right? And they will assume that somebody else is monitoring Splunk, so I don't need to care, right? And the app devs will, happy to open up a PaaS endpoint, a serverless endpoint. They're not connected to Splunk at all. So we have seen, and I think this is a test that even a pen tester should be able to go and do this, right? Stand up a virtual machine on Azure or AWS, right? And even before it boots up, right? Within about 2 minutes or 3 minutes or so, if you attach your monitoring to CloudWatch, CloudTrail, or to Azure Monitor, you will see password, or brute force attacks, password hash attacks, even before the virtual machine has been booted, right? Naturally, it is always open to the internet, right? By default, it is always open to the internet when you stand up a virtual machine, unless you automate it, right? So that you should put it into a network. And that's, that's scary. And we saw that. We stood up, an Azure virtual machine, and, side by side AWS virtual machine. And we actually, counted the time it takes for we seeing the first password hash attacks or brute force attacks. In the case of Azure, it was closer to 1.3 minutes, right? About 100 odd, seconds or so, right? In case of AWS, it was much less than that. It was less than a minute, right? And that's scary, because now if you don't know that you're getting attacked, or you're getting either abused for that matter, or you're breached, right? It is very difficult. So the concept of assume breach, that most enterprises talk about, it's a good concept, but they should put in these detective controls or monitoring controls to even have that visibility. And that's what we also, advise as part of the, as part of an automated monitoring. So these, IAM-based controls, TLS-based encryptions from a data transit standpoint, logging monitoring controls, and all the way down to, whether your storage databases are encrypted, that are they protected from an RBAC standpoint? Do they have, less than about, maybe 2% or 3% of your entire user base who has access to your cloud account, they are, privileged admins or not. Same is the case. We in fact, we have seen some recent attacks with key vaults, be it AWS, KMS services or Azure key vaults. They're open to the internet. By default, they're open to the internet, right? So most times nobody notices them.
Because they're not monitoring them, like you said.
Yeah. Nobody's noticing them that their key vaults are getting accessed. All they've noticed it is that, hey, my billing, for key vault has suddenly started increasing, but they won't notice that somebody's actually accessing it, on an infrequent basis. So monitoring is a huge deal. At least, not focus only on the asset-based monitoring, which is like your virtual machines or containers, but pretty much all of your services. Because if you get hacked into Key Vault, you pretty much get hacked across the board.
It's scary. I feel like it's taken us 20 years to be having conversations about how we secure Active Directory, and we've made headway when it's locally on premises, and still there's organizations that are catching up there. But it could take the next 10 or 20 years for us to have that same level of maturity as we apply it to the cloud.
Yeah. Hey, Paul, I just remembered, on that topic, when you're talking about Active Directory specifically, we have seen instances where organizations have inadvertently exposed their Active Directory fairly openly through the fact that they have, a cloud mirror of what's on-prem. And most of it is just what Guru said. It's misconfiguration or not understanding the correct best practices they need to apply when they actually deploy.
It's one of my fears about DevOps, right? It's that combination of development and operations, which are traditionally more separate. And we've made arguments that it can be more secure, and I get that. However, if you look at a traditional on-premises deployment, you've got development and operations and security, and they're operating independently, right? So there's someone on a physical firewall going, no internet traffic, right? When you go to the cloud and those things are together and you've got developers potentially making decisions, a lot of times making decisions.
And spinning up infrastructure. There's no separate person going, no, I'm managing the firewall, for our cloud instance. The firewall is just all in software and it's part of the development process.
Right, because the developers are, and they're going, my client can't get access to the server, so
open everything.
IP any.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the speed and agility.
Can
actually
I add something to
Paul there?
Sorry, go ahead, Guru. Yeah.
And I think it aggravates a little more, right? So you can now stand up your firewall instances per app, right? There's no centralized firewall.
Right.
It's now software defined. So we've seen that one enterprise customer has closer to 40 odd apps. Each of them has their own instance of a firewall. Has their own instance of a DDoS protection. Some of them have it, some of them don't have it. So there's no standardization, but it gets aggravated because there's no centralized firewall anymore. And you can define a firewall with its own IP, right? For each of the individual apps, and there's no centralized control over it. And that makes it much more difficult.
It used to be when Joff and I were at the university, we managed the firewall. We said on all of our border firewalls, never, ever, ever accept an RDP connection from the internet. And administrators, right, Joff, would come knocking on our door. Like, I really need this. And we're like, no, you need to use the VPN. Like, no, you're not doing that. But now today, that's out the window. That level of control has gone out the window.
Yeah, you're right. And which is why I think companies like Palo Alto and Checkpoint, are still in the game that, hey, now you need to still ensure that kind of a firewall protection. But I think the enterprises are, need to understand that, of course, the cloud-based security services, be it firewall, DDoS protections, they come at a much cheaper price point, right? So the feature to cost, ratio, cost to feature ratio is extremely, favored for the customers. Less than 5% or 10% of, a firewall cost that you would pay to a Palo Alto or Checkpoint vendor, you'd buy it from Azure or AWS. But the problem.
But now the challenge is, how do you centrally manage all those distributed environments? And that's where I think some of the firewall management companies have an opportunity to really hybridize across both on-prem deployments and cloud deployments to really look at the configuration of all these distributed firewalls now. Similar to the conversation we had with OpenVPN yesterday, this concept of a distributed mesh.
It's a mesh.
It's a mesh, right? But how do you centrally manage a highly distributed mesh? And those guys that figure out how to do that actually help us and win the broader firewall management game.
Well, there's an upside, I think, too. The fact that the software stack is starting to merge, it brings with it, software-defined security controls that are all in the cloud, as we know. But it also brings with it the ability to perform microsegmentation. So if you end up with a more centralized strategy where you can orchestrate that, for lack of a better word, in a centralized policy sense, then you potentially have much better chance of enforcing properly than you do with the older model, which was sort of that single brick roadblock kind of model, and everything had to fit into certain layer 3 boundaries to make it work. Now we have the idea that the stack is more vertically integrated, and a lot of those boundaries are driven by the applications. They're driven by the user structure and the directory, and so there's huge opportunities now with the software-defined nature of a decentralized perimeter. It's a matter of people actually seizing upon it and bringing that policy centralization back into the whole framework.
Yeah, and it's that centralization of the policies and management
Yeah.
that's going to be critical.
Yeah, the centralization is necessary, but I think to adding to the point, yes, the verticalization of these stacks are happening, but the problem gets aggravated, because now it is also distributed across multiple cloud accounts.
Yeah.
Right. So you'll have app
Yeah.
1 onto a cloud account 1 and app 2 on a cloud account 2. Right. If you start thinking that, hey, I have production accounts which are relegated to only cloud account 1 to 40, right? How do you centrally manage a centralized policy, let's say for your firewall or for your RDP access at a single console? There's nothing like that because you have it distributed across multiple cloud accounts. So central policy management, either cloud providers themselves will do it, or let's say Palo Alto or Checkpoint or someone like that brings in maybe not necessarily an appliance, but an
Or
inbuilt
some
SaaS
combination.
service, which provides that centralized console view, right? That will be amazing. But there's none like that today.
Well, I think it also it brings in the question and actually raises the visibility again of what we used to call an enterprise architect, somebody that actually has that sort of global perspective of their organization's assets and can exert some design over the top of what's being deployed. That's going to become an even more valuable role when you've got such massive decentralization of the perimeters and such exponential virtualization of the application layer, which is happening right now.
Yeah, that's a great point, Josh, to think about how that role has evolved over time, right?
Or how it needs to evolve.
And it needs to evolve, right? Because back in the day,
it needs to reemerge in a way.
It does,
think.
Josh. You're right. Because back in the day, that was typically a really talented Cisco engineer that was looking at the problem holistically, and there was a lot of physical infrastructure being deployed, and they were architecting how all that stuff tied together.
All those routes happened.
They were managing the routes, but now that's
right.
that's an archaic model today. Now it's all software defined and it's up in the cloud.
I think,
And then
I think
on
that,
top of
that model needs to emerge again, redefined as a new role. And I'm sure forward-thinking organizations are already doing this. I would hope so. And I don't know about you, Paul, but I held that title at one point in my career. You probably did too. And that was a pretty important role back in the day, and it probably should reemerge.
Agreed. Lee?
I was thinking on top of that, the way the cloud is set up, it almost facilitates shadow IT. So to keep an enterprise arm around what's really going on becomes exponentially difficult. And I had a question for Guru, and that was, it seemed like with the complexity of the cloud and when you start discovering what's out there in an enterprise, how much time do you have to spend educating the client about what they have going on because they simply don't understand the intricacies, complexity, or volume?
That's a challenge to us. I think that's a great question. Let me split this into two parts of it. The first part is who do we educate, right? Within the enterprise, there are usually three divisions, that come in and knock on our doors even from an education or training standpoint. The first one is the guys who are provisioning the infrastructure. Traditionally, these days, they've been referred as DevOps, right? The second set of organizations which don't work with them today are the InfoSec team, right? They happen to report into some other organization, could be a CISO, or someone, right? Traditionally, they come in from, I know how do I manage the policies for data center. I know I have some knowledge about cloud, but I have no idea about the various best practices that I can deploy for cloud. Then there's a third, kind of, set of people who are separate from these, which are kind of the internal auditors or even the SOC team, right? Most of the SOC team today, or even the internal auditors, if you bundle them into one organization, we see that, they understand, prevention well, they understand detection well, only for the ones that they know about, which is virtual machines, maybe some containers.
Endpoints.
And maybe very recently some PaaS as well for some of the more innovative enterprises, but they don't have a holistic tool around how do I detect, how do I prevent, how do I identify these threats and try to put caps around it. So we end up initially, and as we started the product, we used to work mostly on the DevOps and InfoSec space, and an area in between to educate both of them as they migrate to the public cloud. But now, as we are becoming more and more of a product company, we've started working and partnering with MSPs, very large MSPs, the top 7 or 8 in the Gartner quadrant, right? We've started working with each one of them, and instead of we educating the enterprises, right, we understand that these enterprises are employing these MSPs. We would rather take the time to educate, and teach how these MSPs to fish, right? And we provide, as a product, we provide the visibility, we provide the set of best practices, and we have a total of about 1,200 or 1,200 best practices, combined for only security and compliance best practices for Azure, AWS, and Office 365. And by the end of the year, we'll be somewhere in the ballpark of between 3,000 to 4,000 odd, best practices over there. So it takes time for us to educate enterprise. So we'll educate MSPs and educate auditors and SOC team on how to integrate. And we also integrate directly into, let's say, ticketing systems. And within the ticketing systems, when we say that there's a deviation, we will put in detailed set of remediation or recommendations that, hey, you can run this script, and we will provide some scripts for them to run, for either guided remediation or auto remediation, or we will tell them that you go into, let's say, Azure console or AWS console and do click, 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 and you are able to go prevent this particular configuration. But we also put a caveat that, the moment you do that, the next release will come in, and that will wipe off all the configurations. So you have to take all of these configurations that we are advising into your DevOps pipeline, do a left shift around it. So it takes time for us to go educate, all of these, because it's very complex, and these 3 organizations typically they don't work with each other at all, right? App dev team or DevOps team, InfoSec team, and traditional GRC or risk management team. And fortunately, and that's the space that we are operating, our product becomes an education tool, a continuous monitoring tool, and a continuous assurance tool by bringing in all of these collaborators on the same data, which is live data, right? And being able to showcase that dashboard to them and click remediate, click auto remediate, or click get a report around it. And that's where we are building the product to. And thankfully, fortunately, Gartner's also recommending our product to their enterprise customers, their MSPs. So hopefully we will see that we might become one of the largest, and we would love it.
We would love that too, Guru. It was so nice having you on the show. I love the conversation. It was absolutely fantastic. To round out this segment, we just want to play 5 questions with Security Weekly. So are you ready?
Your 5 questions. Love it.
We have 5 questions. So, Guru, 3 words to describe yourself.
Curious, maybe intuitive, and very optimistic about the future.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Keyboard. I'm an engineer.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
I would say it's probably Trials and Tribunals of an Engineer Turned a Businessman.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
Grabby Grabby. Ask Grabby Grabby. How interesting. Not sure. Second, maybe.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise?
Otherwise.
Einstein and Robert De Niro.
Oh.
Very weird choices, yeah.
Ooh,
Fantastic. Like Guru, thank you so much for appearing on Security Weekly. Cloudneeti.com/Security Weekly for our listeners that want to learn more. And with that, we'll take a short break. Come back with the security news this week. Lots to talk about. Stay tuned.